The Joe Show. Woo! Hey, everybody, and thanks so much for joining me for another edition of the podcast known as The Joe Show. And my name is Joe Amaral, and I will be your host once again for today. And I'm super excited about today's podcast because I get to talk about my brand new book. That's right, it just came out on February the 20th, 2023. So depending on when you're listening to it, it's actually pretty new. So it's called Jesusly, The Act of Being Like Jesus. And I think it's a book that you'll really enjoy. So the first thing I'm going to invite you to do is just pop on over to Amazon, depending where in the world you live. It might be amazon.com or .ca or whatever. And type in the word Jesusly. And it's just like you think, Jesus with an L-Y at the end. And I promise you, it's the only book that'll come up with that title. One of the parts of my process when I'm writing a new book is I have to have a title or I cannot start. I can't even write the first sentence until I have a title for the book. And this is the process that I've had since the very beginning. And everybody does it a little bit differently. And so once I have the title of the book, the first thing I do after that is I go to Amazon actually. And I type it in. And I want to make sure there's no other book with that title. Or maybe there was a small little indie release 20 years ago, then that might be okay to do. But I love coming up with brand new names or things that are unique to what I'm talking about. So yeah, just go to Amazon and type in Jesusly and it'll come up and you can get it either as a paperback book or as an ebook. And I think it's something that you'll enjoy. Especially if you've been following me for any amount of time, you know what I'm known for, what my heart is, what my passion is. You know, I've been to Israel, I think it's 47 times now at the recording of this podcast, and I've spent well over 10,000 hours over the past 20 years studying the Hebrew culture of the first century to understand the teachings of Jesus, his ministry, his miracles, the actions of his disciples. And that's what I've been doing for over 20 years now. And Jesusly is just the next step in that process of learning. And Jesusly is different in the sense that it's not just purely a research book. Like if you go back to my very first one, Understanding Jesus, it's just like a 200 page essay. And it's very factual. It's got a lot of great insights and some really cool, behind the scenes, we call them backstage kind of insights into the life of Jesus, but it's very fact driven. And that's all I knew how to do at the time. And so there wasn't a lot of heart in it, I'm afraid. As I look back now, all these years later, it's very heady. It's got a lot of knowledge. And if you're into that, that's cool. There's nothing wrong with knowledge. But in this version, in what I'm doing now in Jesusly, I wanted it to have a lot of heart as well. It's great to have information, but as my friends in Liberia would say, you need to move to transformation. It's not just about learning and knowing. It's about how does this affect my life and how does this change the way I behave and the way I treat others. And that was really the genesis for this project for Jesusly, was to pick one of the Gospels and just go through it and evaluate and look at how Jesus treated people. We just all went through a very, unique and difficult season, the global pandemic, just a year and a half ago, whatever it was. And it was tough for a lot of people, being confined to our homes and being quarantined and, all kinds of social events were put on hold, and it was tough for a lot of people, myself included. I'm a people person, and over that pandemic, we just saw a lot of how do I say it? I don't want to say unchristian, but un-Jesusly behavior, if you will. Just the way that people were talking. It's okay to have a conversation. It's okay to come down on different sides of things. It's okay to be on polar opposites sometimes. But I found that in the past, you're always able to work past that. You would acknowledge, hey, you believe something completely different than I do, or you see it differently, and that was it. We were able to move on and continue, a friendship and a relationship. But over that process, over that season, I just noticed that people's words were sharper, they were harsher. The tone, there was a shift in our tone, in the way we talked to each other, and the way we treated each other. Not just Christian to Christian or Christian to non-Christian, but just across all segments of society. And when we were going through that, my mind went back to a time when my son Daniel was 8 years old. So he's 26 now. So you do the math. It was a while ago. And we were all just sitting around chatting. And for the life of me, I can't remember the exact context of the conversation. But he looked over at me and he said, "Daddy, people need to be more Jesusly." And we kind of chuckled because, his 8-year-old mind didn't know what it meant to be Christ-like or to be an imitator of Christ. He just knew, hey, there's thankfully, happily, joyfully, Jesusly, be like him. And that word just stuck in our vernacular. And it's been something that we've used in our family now for well over a decade. And so as I was thinking about just the way that we were acting as, never mind as Christians, just as people, the way we were speaking to each other and being so dismissive and condescending, and people were being judgmental and just downright mean. And I would say, Lord, what are people seeing when they read our posts and they see that kind of behavior? Like, what does that say about you and who Jesus was and the way he treated people? And I said, Lord, we need to be more like you. We need to be more Jesusly. And so the title for the book just naturally came up out of that conversation. So before we get into the heart of the podcast today, do me a favor. I think you'll enjoy the book. Order a copy today at Amazon, like I said, at .com or .ca, and type in Jesusly. Order it and get reading it. It's just under 200 pages. It's written in a very conversational format. I've already had people reach out to me and say, Joe, I read it like in a whole day. It was so easy to read. Some people said, I read it over a couple of nights. And so if you enjoy learning about the Hebraic, the culture and the background, I think you'll enjoy this book. But I decided to go in a slightly different direction, and this book is a bit of a hybrid. And if you do a word count in the book, it's almost like a 50-50 split between, Jewish and cultural background and history, and split that with how Jesus treated people. And in the book, we look at three major categories or groups of people as I see them, and how Jesus reacted to them, how he interacted with them, how he responded to their needs, in juxtaposition often to how the religious were treating people and the society in general. And it was just so beautiful as I began to look at the way Jesus treated people versus the way we treat people. And so I think that if you enjoy, learning about the background, you'll enjoy this extra step as we look at how Jesus treated people. And so the three groups are very simple. We look at the outcasts, as society had labeled them. These were Jewish people who were expelled from their community by their fellow Jews. And we do that today too. We do it in Christian communities. We do it in our ethnic communities. Because they don't behave like we think they should, or they don't do something that we think they should, we cast them out of our little circles, our little societies. And so these outcasts were avoided at all costs by the local people. And it's so interesting to see how the Gospels record Jesus' interactions with them. And so for this book specifically, I'm using the Gospel of Luke. And I do quote from the other Gospel writers, and I talk about the importance of having, 4 viewpoints of the life of Jesus. Why have 4 Gospels? I mean, why can't just one guy tell the story? Well, because we all have a different perspective, right? We all see things differently. Our experiences, they filter the way we see things through the lens of our own experience. And so I decided to use Luke because Luke, as far as we know, is the only Gentile author in the entire scriptures, and certainly in the New Testament. And so Luke, when he is writing to fellow Gentiles, he's writing different things that Matthew, Mark, and John are writing, because those three guys are Jewish men writing to a Jewish audience, and they know that their audience needs to hear certain things about what the Messiah would do and what he wouldn't do. And it's also important to remember that at that point in history, the Jewish people, or the religion of Judaism, was the only religion in humanity in existence that was actually looking for a Messiah. So they were the only ones training for it, preparing for it, equipping themselves for it. And they never thought for a blessed second that it would go outside their own ethnicity, that it would have gone outside their own race or even the land of Israel. No way. This Messiah was being sent by God for the Jewish people, and that's how they thought, and that's how they acted, and that's certainly what they expected. And so Luke comes along, and he sees the ministry of Jesus in an entirely different light. He records stories, relationships, interactions that are unique to Luke, meaning he's the only one who even reports it. The other guys don't even bother to include the stories, but Luke does, because he's trying to show his Gentile audience that the Messiah is now for the masses. It's not just for one nation. It's not just for one group of people. And it's really beautiful. For instance, I'll just give you a couple examples. I don't want to give away the whole book here. But for instance, the story of Zacchaeus, the tax collector that climbs the sycamore tree. Luke is the only one who tells us that story. Why? Because Zacchaeus is an outcast. He's a tax collector. He is hated by the people. As far as they're concerned, he's a traitor. He's working with the Romans. He's working with the enemy, extorting money from his own people. He's an outcast. There's no way the gospel is for him. But Luke comes along and says, no, that's not how Jesus sees people. He doesn't see them by their designated labels given to them by society. He sees people for who they really are and for what they can truly be. And so this is the first group that I look at in the book Jesusly is the outcasts. And some of you listening today, maybe you feel like an outcast because you believe differently than maybe the church or denomination that you've been a part of, and you felt a little ostracized. I think this book will really encourage you. It'll speak to you, and it'll remind you of how loved you are just for being you, no matter what society says. Doesn't matter what family says, or the church group that you're part of says. What does Jesus think of you? And I think as you read through this first section known as the outcasts, I think you're going to feel a lot more loved as you see how Jesus looks beyond all of those impediments put there by people. And Jesus does away with politics and procedures and policies, and he looks and he sees people. And that's one of the things that I am so passionate about, and that's why I wanted to write the book this way, not just give you a ton of really cool info. Like I said, you're going to find a lot of really great cultural nuggets, things I've never talked about before. Some things I did cover in my first couple of books, but I've expanded on them. You can imagine 20 years after my initial research, I'm still learning, I'm still growing, and there's been more to add to some stories. But as we look and we see the way Jesus treated and dealt with outcasts, it's just so beautiful and so powerful to see the way he loves. And then in the second section, I talk about the outsiders. These are people who were ethnically not Jewish. And so as far as that culture was concerned, the gospel wasn't for them. Now, they weren't being mean. They weren't saying, no, we don't want you to have it. They never expected it. I told you, not for a moment. that the Messiah would be for the uncircumcised, for the unkosher, for those who don't observe all the laws of the Torah. There's no way God could come for them. It never dawned on them. It never even entered their minds, because everything they read about, everything they knew had conditioned them to expect this Messiah to come for them and for them alone. We see this come up in the book of Acts, which Luke wrote as well. And so between the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, it's such a big volume that it actually puts Luke over the top as the single largest contributor to the New Testament of anyone else. Now, I know what you're thinking. Hang on a second. Paul wrote a ton of books. Yeah, but some of them were very small. If you do a word count, dollar for dollar, Luke, he emerges as the champ. He writes more than anybody else. And so Luke records the story in Acts of when the apostle or disciple Peter is on the rooftop in Jaffa. And you probably know the story. He's there, and then he gets this vision of this sheet coming down from heaven, and all these unclean animals start sliding down it, and the voice says, rise up, kill and eat. And he's like, no way, these are not kosher. Like, there's pigs and all kinds of unclean animals. There's no way I'm eating it. And then the vision comes a second time, and then it comes a third time, and then he snaps out of it. And the moment he snaps out of this vision, there's a knock at the door. And the timing is very, very interesting, because he just got a vision from God where at the end he says, don't call anything unclean that I have now declared to be clean. This is huge. And most people think it's about food, and it could be, but there's a way bigger picture here, because the scripture answers itself. And so many times people, they read one verse. It's called eisegesis. It's a way of studying the Bible. And they take that one verse to make it mean or say whatever they want it to mean or say. But if you just continue reading the story, it answers itself. What was unclean? What were the animals representing? Because the people knocking at the door were Gentiles. Unclean, uncircumcised Gentiles. And they were sent by a Roman centurion. He was an outsider, 100%, hated by the people. Even though he was God-fearing, he was still a Roman centurion. People would have been executed under him. They would have been beaten. They would have been mistreated. And God spoke to this guy, Cornelius, in a place called Caesarea, and he said, go and send for a man in Jaffa named Peter, and he's going to tell you about me. And it's really interesting to follow the story, because Peter says, okay, I'll go. But when he gets to the house of Cornelius, the first thing he does before he comes inside, before he starts to share the gospel, before he does anything, he says, look, listen, this is really, really rare, and it's kind of freaking me out, because you know that we Jews, we do not associate with you guys, let alone come into your house. But God showed me what? In a vision, that I should not declare anything unclean that he has now made clean. This would have been mind-blowing. You talk about a paradigm shift. What? God is saying Gentiles can now be considered to be clean if they accept the gospel, the message of Jesus? This is huge. And so Luke records the story. And when Peter gets to Jerusalem, he's got some splaining to do. They're like, hey, we heard something crazy, Peter. We heard that you went into the house of a Gentile. We must have misheard. Tell us what really happened. And they're blown away that God would pour out his Spirit on the Gentiles in the same way that he had on the Jews. And so we get this beautiful interaction of Jesus and the disciples with these outsiders. And it's just, it's beautiful isn't the right word. It's precious. And Luke has this view. He's got this perspective that the other guys don't, because he wasn't raised in the same religion. He wasn't raised in the same country even. And so he himself is coming to it as an outsider. And you have these beautiful interactions of John the Baptist, of Peter, of Jesus with these Roman soldiers who were really, really looked down on by the locals. And Jesus just elevates them. I'm not going to tell you the whole story because I want you to buy the book, okay? But there's a story where there's a Roman centurion in Capernaum, which is a very strategic little community on the northwest shores of the Sea of Galilee. And to make a very long story short, there's a Roman centurion whose servant is sick and is at the brink of death. And he says to his other servants, go tell Jesus that we need prayer for this guy. But he himself doesn't go, and he begins to explain about how he's a man of authority, and he knows that if he just says the word, things will get done. And Jesus is so moved and so touched by this that in Capernaum, a very, very religious Jewish community, he looks at them and he says, did you hear what this Roman just said? He goes, I've not seen greater faith in all of Israel than in this unclean, uncircumcised, non-Torah observant Roman centurion. And again, you talk about a paradigm shift. That would have absolutely freaked the people out. That Jesus would elevate a Roman soldier, an outsider, above his own people. And on one occasion, they said to Jesus, why are you going into these people's homes? Why are you hanging out with them? You're doing so well. Why would you risk losing the support of the people by being associated with these unclean Gentiles? And Jesus says, guys, you're not getting it. It's not the well who need the doctor. It's the sick. I came for them. I'm here for you, but I came for them as well. And just the way he deals with these outsiders, people who were rejected and cast out by society. And so the first section of the book, I devote a big chunk of it to dealing with the outcasts, and then a good portion talking about the outsiders. And I'm giving you just a very broad perspective of the book here. And I'm hoping to whet your appetite. I got to be honest with you. I'm really hoping that you're going to want to dive into this book and just see the way he loved people and then say, I want to be like that. I want to be Jesusly. I want to act like him. I want to behave like him. I want to treat others the way he did. Not the way we saw during the pandemic, not the way we see during, different voting seasons and cycles, but I want to act, I want to behave, I want to treat people the way Jesus did. I want to be Jesusly. And then the third section of the book, I call them the overlooked. These were people that society didn't even bother. Didn't even give them a second thought. The overlooked, the women of the first century, the women who were alive during the time of the New Testament. They were seen as having very few functions, clean the house, cook, pop out babies, and that's pretty much it. Can God actually use a woman to do something great for him? Could God love the women of the society the same way he did the men? Were they of the same value? Well, if you go back and read, not just in Jewish culture, but in most cultures during that time, the answer is no. They didn't believe that there was equality. But Jesus just looks past all that. And there's so many stories, again, recorded by Luke. Luke is the one who tells us about the woman who had led the sinful life and poured out her tears at his feet. Luke is the only one who mentions Elizabeth, the mother of John the Baptist, by name. Can you believe that? No one else does. Luke mentions Anna the prophetess in the temple who declared that he was the Messiah. And so let me give you just a little quick insight into the way he treated these people that were overlooked, these women of the scriptures. Now, I talked about this woman in my first book, the woman who had the issue of blood. And, I focused on the Greek and I focused on the prophetic part of that passage. And without giving everything away, there was something very unique about the prayer shawl that Jesus was wearing, in that there was a belief that came from Malachi that said that one day there would be healing in the wings of the Messiah. And the wings were the tassels on the corners of the prayer shawl that every Jewish male was wearing in those days. And so the belief was that there would be healing in the wings, in the tassels of the prayer shawl. And so this is very known to the people, but of course not known to us. But we see an interaction that Jesus has with a woman that pushes the conversation to more than just information. There is transformation in that story, because the woman knows that she's done wrong according to the culture and the days that she was living in, because she's unclean, she's bleeding, so she's supposed to be at home, because everything she touches becomes unclean, and everyone she touches becomes unclean. So she knew she should not have been in a crowded place, but she was so desperate for change. She was so desperate for God to move in her life that she pushes through the crowds and she gets to Jesus. And you know the story. She touches the hem, right? The wing of the garment, which is an exact fulfillment of what Malachi said, that there would be healing in the wings and the tassels of the Messiah. And Luke tells us that the moment she touched the tassels, power went from Jesus. He said, somebody here touched me. He felt power flow out of him. And that is just, it gives me goosebumps even now as I'm sitting here in my little office recording this, that he literally felt the power leave his body and go through that tassel, through that wing of his prayer shawl into this woman. And they go searching through the crowds, and here she is. She's like, it's only a matter of time. They're going to find out it's me. I better fess up. And she figured, oh, well, it was worth a shot. I mean, I was going to bleed to death anyway, so if they're going to stone me for, making this Messiah, this rabbi unclean, then I'll face the music. And the Bible says that she's on her hands and knees. She's in a groveling, begging posture. And Jesus says, get up. Oh, I love that. Woman, get up. And the implication is that beggars and thieves and grovelers, they come on their hands and feet, but not you. No. You're different. You actually know who I am, because I felt the power go out from the wings into you. You know that I'm the Messiah. And because you were sick and now you're not sick, you're healed. You've just showed everybody that I have fulfilled the prophecy of Malachi, that there is healing in the wings of my prayer shawl. And everybody can see now that you're no longer sick. And because of you, Israel now knows that the Messiah is here. And that woman, that overlooked bottom rung of society woman, is the first person in history to publicly declare that Jesus was the Messiah. And it's just like, wow. That is such a Jesusly thing to do, to take somebody who was overlooked, who was an outcast, that eventually felt like an outsider. And he says, I came for people just like her. And that's the message of the book. That's the message of Jesusly. The subtitle is The Act of Being Like Jesus. So how do we be like Jesus? It's not about being demonstrative with our words. It's not about being judgmental. It's not about making people feel bad about what they believe or about what they say. No, it's the complete opposite. Being Jesusly is looking past all the preconditions and all the presuppositions that society has placed on a person. And you say, I see you. I see you, the person inside you that was created in the image of God, that is loved by God. That's the message of Jesusly. So yeah, get the book, learn some really cool stuff. There's a lot of stuff in there that I talk about Roman culture that I don't even know if it's ever been written about before. It's certainly been out there, but not just put all together in one book. I think your mind's going to be blown as you learn about a lot of the beautiful, the deeper meanings of different miracles and in conversations that Jesus had with people. You're going to have like a lot of wow moments. I know that. But I want your heart to have a wow moment. I want you to say, oh God, I've been the one who's decided who an outcast is. I'm the one who's treated people as an outsider because maybe they don't look like me or dress like me or believe like me. And I'm the one who labeled them an outsider. And maybe you've overlooked people in your life because maybe they don't have the same education as you do. Maybe they're not a VP of a big company like you are. Maybe they have a lower position, at least according to the way you think. And you've overlooked that person and you've made them feel bad about themselves because of who they are. Today is the day where we say, enough, Lord. We want to be Jesusly. So here's something that I want you to do. This is a challenge from this podcast edition that I want to give to you. I want you to think about those three people groups. I want you to think about people that have been considered to be outcasts or outsiders or overlooked. And if there's anybody in your life that you've put into those categories and then treated them that way, I want you to pray about how you can be Jesusly to them. What would be the most Jesusly thing that you could do to reflect who He really was in their lives? And I think that as we read through the Gospel of Luke and we see how Jesus treated others, folks, I think that's how we change our culture. That's how we change our society, not by yelling at them, not by denigrating, not by putting them down, not by making them feel bad, but by lifting them up. And I think the most important thing we can do is make them feel seen. Make them feel seen. You know, I'm going to close with this. When Zacchaeus was in that tree and Jesus called him down, he could have used the labels that the society had given him. He could have said, hey, tax collector, come on down. Hey, thief. Hey, corrupt. Hey, traitor. He could have used any of those titles, and the people would have probably cheered and said, that's right. You call him for what he is, Jesus. You tell that traitor. You rip him a new one. That's right. But no, Jesus looks up at him and he says, Zacchaeus, I want you to come down from that tree. And we say, okay, he called him by his name, but names didn't mean back then what they mean today. You know, it wasn't just, oh, this is a trending name, so let's call him this or that. No, you gave someone a name because that was the personality you thought that they were going to have as they grew up. And we see this in the scripture. God changes people's names because they were one way, but they didn't have an encounter with God, and He changes their name. We see it with Jacob. We see this with Abraham. And so with Zacchaeus, his name means pure one, which would have been a total oxymoron to the community. They would have said, pure, this guy is anything but. He is not pure. He is impure. He is defiled. But Jesus says, hey, pure one, Zacchaeus, come down from that tree. I want to have dinner with you tonight. And that's my prayer as we close off this edition of the podcast. Oh, Lord, give us the ability to be Jesusly, to be more like you, to see people the way you see people, Lord. That's my prayer for anybody listening to this today. And here's the last thing. I'm such a preacher. I keep saying it's the last thing, and then I just keep going. I apologize. I know that the majority of the people listening to the podcast today, you know, probably come from a Christian background, or at the very least were raised in a Christian home or environment. But here's the really cool thing about the life and teaching of Jesus, and it's this. You don't have to profess to be a Christian. You don't have to profess to be even a follower of Jesus to imitate His behavior. The way He treated people is an example for anyone and everyone, everywhere and anywhere. It doesn't matter where you're from. Could you imagine a world where people loved people the way Jesus did? If we began to embrace the outcast, welcome the outsider, and see the overlooked. I hope and pray that even just one person listening to this podcast today would say, I need to be I want to be, I'm going to be more Jesusly. That's the message that I want to leave you with. So friends, do me a favor, pop onto Amazon, search out Jesusly, order the book today, and don't just read it, but let it really get into your heart, let it get into your very being. And the more we become like him, the more Jesusly we become, the better this world would be. Thank you guys so much for joining me today. We'll see you next time on The Joe Show.